16-year-old Sylvia Likens was entrusted to a family friend, Gertrude Baniszewski, while her parents travelled, but the caregiver could not, in fact, be trusted. Gertrude tortured the girl to death, but she didn't act alone. She managed to involve the entire neighbourhood of kids to help her kill Sylvia, including her own 7 children, and even Sylvia's own little sister Jenny. Sylvia's parents were carnival workers and were therefore on the road more often than not. They struggled to make ends meet, as her father Lester had only an 8th grade education and a total of 5 children to care for. Jenny was quiet and withdrawn with a limp from polio. Sylvia was more confident and went by the nickname Cookie, and had been described as pretty, though she had a missing front tooth. In July 1965, Lester Likens decided to take up with the carnival again, while his wife was jailed for shoplifting that summer. Sylvia's brothers, Danny and Benny, were put into the care of their grandparents. With few other options, Sylvia and Jenny were sent to stay with a family friend named Gertrude Baniszewski. Gertrude was every bit as poor as the Likens and had 7 of her own kids to support in her rundown home. She made little cash by charging her neighbours a few dollars to iron their laundry. She already had been through multiple divorces, some of which resulted in physical abuse against her, and dealt with a crippling depression through heavy doses of prescription drugs. She was in no condition to take care of 2 teenage girls. The Likens, though, didn't think they had any other choice. Lester Likens cryptically requested that Baniszewski straighten his daughters out when he placed them in her care for $20 a week. For the first 2 weeks at the Baniszewskis, Sylvia and her daughter were treated kindly enough, though Gertrude's older daughter, 17-year-old Paula Baniszewski, seemed to butt heads with Sylvia often. Then one week, their father's payment came in late. "I took care of you 2 bitches for 2 weeks for nothing," Gertrude spat at Sylvia and Jenny. She grabbed Sylvia by the arm, dragged her into a room, and closed the door. Jenny could only sit outside the door and listen as her sister screamed. The money arrived the following day, but the torture had just begun. Gertrude soon began to abuse Sylvia and Jenny in broad daylight. Though a frail woman, Gertrude used a heavy paddle and thick leather belt from one of her husbands, who had been a cop. When she was too exhausted or too weak to discipline the girls herself, Paula stepped in to take her place. Sylvia, however, soon became the focus of the abuse. Gertrude demanded that Jenny join in, lest she take her sister's place as the brunt of the abuse. Gertrude accused Sylvia of stealing from her and burnt the girl's fingertips. She took her to a church function and force-fed her free hot dogs until she was sick. Then, as punishment for throwing up the good food, she forced her to eat her own vomit. She allowed her children, in fact, encouraged her children to partake in the abuse of Sylvia and her sister. The Baniszewski kids practiced karate on Sylvia, slammed her into walls and onto the floor. They used her skin as an ashtray, threw her downstairs, and cut open her skin and rubbed salt into her wounds. After this, she would often be cleansed in a scalding hot bath. Gertrude gave sermons on the evils of sexual immorality, while Paula stomped on Sylvia's vagina. Paula, who was pregnant, accused Sylvia of being the same and mutilated the girl's genitals. Gertrude's 12-year-old son, John Jr., delighted in forcing the girl to lick his youngest sibling's soiled diapers clean. Sylvia was forced to strip naked and shove an empty Coca-Cola bottle into her vagina while the Baniszewski children watched. Sylvia was so beaten that she was unable to use the bathroom voluntarily. When she wet her mattress, Gertrude decided that the girl was no longer fit to live with the rest of her children. The 16-year-old was then locked in the basement without food or access to the bathroom. Gertrude spread every story she could imagine to get the local kids to join in on the beatings. She told her daughter that Sylvia had called her a whore and got her daughter's friends to come over and beat her up for it. Later during the trial, some of the kids were open about how Gertrude had recruited them. One teenage girl named Anna Cisco recalled how Gertrude told her that Sylvia had been saying, "She said my mother went out with all sorts of men and got $5 for going to bed with the men." Anna never bothered to find out if it was true. Gertrude told her, "I don't care what you do to Sylvia." She invited her over to her home and just watched as Anna threw Sylvia down to the ground, beat her face and kicked her. Gertrude told her own children that Sylvia was a prostitute. Then she had Ricky Hobbs, a neighbourhood boy, and her 11-year-old daughter, Marie, carved the words, "I'm a prostitute and proud of it," into her abdomen with a heated needle. At one point, Sylvia's older sister, Diana, attempted to see the girls under Gertrude's care, but was turned away at the door. Jenny later reported how Diana snuck food into the basement in which Sylvia was hidden. A neighbour had also reported the incidents to a public health nurse, who upon entering the home and not seeing Sylvia, for she was locked in the basement, concluded that nothing was wrong. Baniszewski had also managed to convince the nurse that she had kicked the Likens girls out. Other next-door neighbours allegedly were aware of how Sylvia was abused. They had seen Paula strike the girl in the Baniszewski's home on 2 separate occasions, but claimed not to report the abuse because they feared for their own lives. Jenny was threatened, bullied and beaten by the Baniszewskis and neighbour girls alike should she go to the authorities. The abuse of Sylvia continued unhindered, in fact aided by all those around her. "I'm going to die," Sylvia told her sister 3 days before she did. "I can tell." Gertrude could tell too, and so she forced Sylvia to write a note in which she told her parents that she would run away. Sylvia was also forced to write that she'd met up with a group of boys and given them sexual favours, and afterwards they'd beaten her and mutilated her body. Shortly after this, Sylvia overheard Gertrude Baniszewski tell her children that she was going to take Sylvia to a forest and leave her there to die. A desperate Sylvia Likens attempted one final escape. She managed to get out the front door before Gertrude caught her. Sylvia was so weak from her injuries that she could not have possibly gotten too far. With the assistance of a neighbour boy named Coy Hubbard, Gertrude beat Sylvia with a curtain rod until she fell unconscious. Then, when she came back to, she stomped on her head. Sylvia was pronounced dead on the 26th of October 1965 from a brain hemorrhage, shock and malnutrition. After 3 months of torture and starvation, she could no longer form intelligible words and could barely move her limbs. When the police came, Gertrude stuck with her cover story. Sylvia had been out with the boys in the woods, she told them, and they'd beaten her to death and carved "I'm a prostitute and proud of it" into her body. Jenny, though, took a chance. As soon as she could get close enough to the police officer, she whispered, "Get me out of here and I'll tell you everything." The police arrested Gertrude, Paula, Stephanie and John Baniszewski, Richard Hobbs and Coy Hubbard for murder. Neighbourhood participants Mike Munro, Randy Lepper, Darlene Maguire, Judy Duke and Anna Cisco were also arrested for injury to person. These minors would blame Gertrude for being pressured to partake in the slaughter of Sylvia Likens. Gertrude herself pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity. "She's not responsible," her defence attorney told the court, "because she's not all here." There were several more children involved who proved just too young to be charged. Ultimately, though, on the 19th of May 1966, Gertrude was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life imprisonment. She was spared the death penalty, despite her own lawyer admitting that, in my opinion, she ought to go to the electric chair. Paula Baniszewski, who had given birth to a daughter during the trial, was convicted of second-degree murder and was also sentenced to life imprisonment. Richard Hobbs, Coy Hubbard and John Baniszewski Jr. were all convicted of manslaughter and given 2 to 21-year prison sentences based on the fact that they were minors. All 3 boys were all paroled just 2 years later in 1968. Gertrude spent 20 years behind bars. There was no question about her guilt. The autopsy backed up everything Jenny told the police. Sylvia Likens had died slowly and painfully over several months.